Joining us. Again, this is Catherine Clark. I'm the VP of Community Engagement here at Housing Assistance Corporation. Thank you for starting the year by kicking off your training here with Advocacy 101 with our expert, Stefanie Coxe, who's joining us. Just some quick housekeeping, just so everyone is aware. We are recording this session, so after the program ends tomorrow, we will be sending out an email just with the recorded meeting so that you all have that available along with the slides and resources that Stefanie will be sharing during the training. So thank you all again for joining us today and kicking off the new year. And I will pass it to Stefanie Coxe from Home Builders and Remodelers, one of our Housing to Protect Cape Cod coalition partners.
Thank you, Catherine. It's nice to see so many, well, not quite faces because most of your cameras are off, but I understand. Zoom fatigue. I won't take it personally. As Catherine was mentioning, we've got the chat here. If anyone has questions as we go along, please just throw them in the chat, and Catherine will, ask them for me, so I don't have to pay attention to two different to screens. But so I'm going to share my screen now. Get started with the. Can everybody see the slide deck?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so as Catherine said, my name is Stefanie Coxe. I am the executive officer of the Home Builders and Remodelers Association of Cape Cod. We are a coalition partner of Housing to Protect Cape Cod, and HPCC, which also includes the Cape Cod Chamber of Commerce and the Realtors Association, came together because we said, listen, we've got this housing crisis. We shouldn't be working at these things in silos, and we obviously know we need to have more year-round housing. We know that our economy needs it. But we also know we need to do it in a way that is thoughtful to our environment. So how do we kind of go about that? And so we came together and created this coalition. And one of the key things that we do is provide these types of trainings. So you'll see a slide at the end with other upcoming trainings. This is kind of meant as part of a series, the first of three that build on each other. The first part of this today is we wanted you to be able to just get a sense of kind of when we're talking about housing, we're talking about the nature of the problem, what are we talking about? When we're talking about the solution, what are we talking about? When we're talking about when people say no to housing, what are they saying? And how can you respond to that? What are the myths? Debunking those myths. And then just generally kind of how do you engage in a public way? Because I know that not everyone feels comfortable going up to a podium or speaking on Zoom in front of the public or writing an email or what have you. So we want to break that down, make that as simple as possible, and then from there, we'll talk about more about in the process with the planning boards, and then in the spring do another one on town meetings. So it's really meant to kind of ease people into housing advocacy because we know that it's not something that you're going to go from what was it that we called before, like couch potato to 5K, like couch potato to housing advocate. We're not going to do that overnight, right? So one of the things that I will talk about during our actual meat and potatoes of the advocacy training is that it's always important when you're giving any kind of presentation to do just a quick elevator speech. If you were on the fifth floor of the State House and you were in the elevator with the governor, what could you say to her to kind of get across like who you are and what you'd like to talk about, and in a way that she understood it, that by the time you got to the first floor of the basement. So I'm wondering if we could have one or two volunteers just to do a quick elevator speech, just to kind of ease into it a little bit. And we just start with, your name, your town, and what, if any, advocacy that you've done before. And I'll stop the share so that we can see the screen. So I know there's got to be a couple of people who are willing to. It's a much smaller, friendlier crowd than if you were, say, doing this at like town meeting floor. Andrea? Can we, hold on, we gotta unmute you.
I'm gonna mute you, Andrea. Let me
And it
find
looks like we got Elizabeth too.
go.
That's
You should be able to unmute.
okay. I'll move.
There
I'll
we go.
move. Is
There
that
you go.
good now?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes. All right. Hello, everyone. So my name is Andrea Davis. I am a housing counselor with HAC, and I had opportunity to serve as outreach educator in my community. Um, I also serve as advocate, a court advocate. So I guess I've been in this kind of role of serving for a little while. I'm back at Hackey as counselor, as a counselor, housing counselor.
Wonderful. Full circle. How about Elizabeth and then Mallory? And I think that'll be a good number.
Hi,
Hi,
my
Elizabeth.
name my name is Elizabeth Harder. I'm the chair of the Harwich Housing Authority and Harwich Housing Committee, as well as being Harwich delegate to Barnstable County Assembly of Delegates. The Cape is in crisis right now. We are losing the people we need to live here, and we are becoming a it is becoming dangerous because we can no longer afford firefighters and police officers, among others, that are crucial to having a well-rounded um, environment. So please help us. That's my pitch.
Elizabeth isn't busy at all. How about Mallory?
Hi, thanks, Stephanie. Hard to follow a powerhouse like Elizabeth Harder, an idol. But my name is Mallory Yanone. I'm the community organizing manager for Community Development Partnership, and I run grassroots groups in 4 of the 8 towns we serve to raise awareness about housing advocacy. But the way I like to start conversations is I say who I am and what I do, but I also say I am affected by this housing crisis and share my story because that's what really seems to resonate with people.
Yes. Yes, you are spot on. We are going to talk about storytelling as being a critical component when it comes to changing minds. All right, so I'm going to go back to my slide deck here. All right, everyone able to see that? Good. Okay. So again, oops, did too many times. So again, I like to start with making sure we all are using common language around what the problem is and then talking about what the solution is, right? So let's talk about, we all kind of grew up and just heard the term affordable housing. And, when that comes to mind, you're thinking of the kind that's, it's deed restricted, it's income restricted, it's the capital A kind, right? And that type of affordable housing, it tends to serve, people who make 80% of area median income or less, sometimes a little bit higher. There are efforts to bring it up to 100, 110%. Then at a certain point, you wonder, like, what are we going to do for people who make 200% of area median income? Like, that might not make sense because you need all these different sources of funding to pay for it, right? So, like, when Housing Assistance Corporation is building, capital A affordable housing, they have to apply, or lowercase CDP, they have to apply for low income housing tax credit money. They have to, get all these different sources, cobble it together. It's a very complex process. And it's not necessarily what is going to solve the nature of the problem for everyone else in kind of the middle. So when I talk about the housing crisis on Cape Cod, I talk about the need for attainable housing as well as for affordable housing. So what I mean by that is, um, you know, when most of us, when we were first starting out, we all usually start out as renters, right? We were, depending on where you are in your career, in your life setting, usually you're able to find something that is naturally affordable. So maybe that starts off as an apartment, and then you move up to, you're renting a single family home, and then eventually maybe you're buying something. But it's the Goldilocks and the Three Bears, like wherever you are in your life, there's going to be a price point that is naturally affordable to you. In a healthy market, that's how the economy works, right? But we don't have a healthy housing market because we have constricted and made it illegal to build the type of housing that is naturally affordable to everybody, up below a certain point, and that point keeps going up and up and up. And so when we talk about the nature of the crisis, we're talking about the need to allow people to afford on their own without any government assistance, naturally affordable housing that can be built by builders, by developers, not necessarily by a nonprofit, not by government. It's just choices in the marketplace. That's all we're really talking about. And then filling the gaps for folks who would never necessarily be able to find those naturally affordable units with the capital A, right? Instead of doing it the backwards way, which is kind of how we've done it for 50 or 60 years. So, and some of these statistics, forgive us, these are a little bit old, and so they're definitely, it's the amount you can afford to buy these days has definitely dwindled. But so when you think about the actual workforce, when you think about accountants, teachers, landscapers, based on what they make and what they can actually afford to pay, it's significantly, there's a major gap there between what they can afford to pay and what is available in the marketplace. So again, this is older data, but this is, in fact, I think we put this together for another presentation maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and the price has gone up so much. But you see how for single family homes, like in 2012, it was like 310, 320 to buy a single family home on the Cape. Now it's well over 700. So, you see this, like nobody's income has doubled, that much in 10 years, right? Like, no, and you didn't see that type of doubling happening in the previous 10 years, or the 10 years before that, or the 10 years before that. So what we're seeing is things are just really getting worse, and they're getting worse faster and faster because they're snowballing. And then you have the prices for rent. This again, it's gone up. But just a 1 bedroom, you'd be paying 2,200, 2,500. It's really, I mean, I see actual single family homes renting for 4,800, sometimes more. Really, really unattainable. So obviously, big mismatch between what working people make and what is available in the marketplace. Why? Because we don't build enough housing, right? The data is the data. Basically since the early aughts, we have just not been building enough housing, period. And then specifically, we haven't been building the type of housing that is attainable to the Cape's workforce. And this can be applied across the state and across the country. This is not a situation unique to the Cape. What is unique to the Cape is this sort of dynamic of, our purchasing power as locals who are working in the local workforce. We are always going to be outbid when it comes to the purchasing power of second home buyers, who tend to be cash buyers. So that differential is somewhat unique, but it is only one of several causes, right? So we can't necessarily do anything about that, but we can do something about the lack of overall production and the outdated zoning that makes it illegal to build these smaller units. Thankfully, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the legislature, the governor passed a law last year that makes it legal to build accessory dwelling units. I myself did a lot of work passing zoning bylaws on the Cape before that to make it legal. But in-law apartments, that's a great example of smaller units, but you can also, when I talk about smaller units, I'm also talking about duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, small multifamily homes as well as apartment buildings, right? Again, it's that Goldilocks trying to find the match for the neighborhood, what works. But right now, up until last year, the only thing it was legal to build was single family homes. Now it's legal to build single family homes and accessory dwelling units. Great, but there's still more work to be done, right? So we need to be pushing for more choices in the marketplace. And we are all experiencing what housing assistance predicted with our report that we did a number of years ago. I was a consultant for that, the high cost of doing nothing. Okay, what's going to happen? This is a report we did in 2018. Well, you're going to see, um, you know, lack of access to core goods and services because there's no one left to work here. What happened, right? You're going to see more traffic year round. What happened? Have you tried being on the highway, at rush hour? It's crazy these days. And you see that we as locals have less and less purchasing power, and because everyone is trying to, staff their restaurants, their shops, what have you, with workers, but then they end up having to pay for their workers' housing, so then they have to charge more. So it leads to this deleterious effect that this just swirling whirlpool down of our economy. And it's really, as Elizabeth said, it is dangerous. So what is the solution? The solution is to legalize housing. It is, as I mentioned, illegal to build all these other things besides ADUs and single family homes. So what do we have to do? We need to make it legal. That's really as simple as it is. And then on top of that, as I mentioned, doing those low income capital A housing solutions, right? That's the match that we need to line up. So before I start getting into some of the myths around this, Catherine, do we have any questions in the chat?
No questions yet, but keep them
Oh.
coming. This is a very dynamic presentation that Stephanie shared. So
Yeah, so feel free to throw the questions in at any point, and I'll try to answer them as I go. So as we are, talking about this, when we talk about legalizing housing, there are generally just a handful of reasons that people have for opposing them. And they're generally actually myths. And so when you strip back some of those myths, there's really not much left in terms of not much left that's acceptable, socially acceptable, let me put it that way, of why to oppose housing. So one of them is this idea that single family only zoning is the way that we've always done things. Now, I am a housing advocate, and I thought this for the longest time. I grew up here on the Cape. I was like, oh, this is how it is. This is just how we've always done things, and like Levittown, and that's our American history. No, it's actually not. So first of all, if you drive up and down 6A, the historic parts of Cape Cod, you will actually see tons of what's called pre-existing non-conforming, which basically means like grandfathered, multifamily properties, accessory dwelling units, duplexes. Like, we had it legal for a long, long time to build things other than single family homes. It was only in the last century that we made it illegal. And, again, this was surprising to me as I started to learn more about the history around single family only zoning, but it's a very ugly history. There's a great book I highly recommend called The Color of Law that really gets into a lot of the history of it. But, basically you had a lot of systemic attempts to keep people of color and people of certain incomes out of communities. In some cases, people were trying to do it through, you might even see it on your deed if you have an old house, like that it can't be rented to or sold to a person of color. There was zoning that said that only whites can live here. There's lots of really very overt racist attempts to keep people out of communities. And then the Supreme Court said, well, no, you can't actually do that. That's going a bit too far. So the reaction was, okay, well, what are some less obvious ways we can do it? And when you take a look at the totality of things that are available, say in, I mentioned Levittown, so say post World War II, you know, I'm a soldier, I'm coming home from fighting war, I want to access the GI Bill, but I'm a person of color. Oh, not accessible to me. So I can't do that. I can't get those loans. So, and because of a lot of the other things that I'm kept out of, then what's naturally affordable to me is going to be an apartment. So what do the municipalities do? They say, oh, we're going to ban the apartment buildings. So this is how we got into this situation. And I think it's really important to understand that history and own that history. If people say, we like single family homes, and neighborhoods as they are for the aesthetics, that's perfectly valid. But it's just important for people to understand the history of how we got where we did. The second myth that we come across is that multifamily housing is ugly. And historically, sometimes that's been true, right? But I also like to say that, a lot of the duplexes and whatnot that you tend to see around the Cape were built in the 70s. And anything built in the 70s, in my opinion, it tends to be a little odd architecturally. I only look at my alma mater of UMass Boston and Boston City Hall for examples. And so the truth of the matter is, and we all see them, there's plenty of single family homes that are not nice to look at, right? So we don't have to use that as a reason to say no to housing. If aesthetics are a concern, there is a way of zoning called form-based code, which actually the town of Barnstable took up a couple of years ago, and they did for the Main Street area of Hyannis. And it's basically saying, okay, we're going to say yes to and make it easier to build multifamily, but it has to do this, and this. That means like the height needs to be this, the setbacks need to be this. You can use form-based code to say, we want to have these kind of architectural details. We want to have parking out back. We want to have, you could do it for kind of anything to make sure that what actually gets built does indeed fit in with the community character, because that is important. But it's also important to recognize that we don't apply those standards to single family homes, right? We don't say all the single family homes need to look a certain way. So that being said, there are ways to make sure that what gets built is indeed going to fit in with community character. The third big myth is that multifamily homes are the same thing as density. And we in the housing community are probably our own worst enemies on this, because we have conflated them ourselves. But the fact of the matter is that a duplex, a triplex, quadplex could exist on the same property as where a single family home, particularly, a larger property that currently hosts a McMansion. Those can be done with the same number of bedrooms, the same number of people, same setbacks, and et cetera, as a single family home. So the example I like to use is if I have, let's say, a 2-acre property, and I want to build on it. And right now I could build, let's say, a 6 or 7 bedroom mansion. And I would have all these different rules that I'd have to follow, but I could get my building permit, as long as I met all of those criteria. I, as that property owner, don't have any choice of basically anything else that I can build. It's only going to be a single family. But if I were to have a choice in the matter, I could maybe build a duplex with two-bedroom apartments, or a triplex with, you know, a 1 bedroom and two bedrooms. And I would still be under the number of bedrooms from a septic perspective than the single family home. And I could stay within the setbacks and lot coverage requirements of the single family home. So I wouldn't be having any greater intensity of use on that property than the single family home. It's important to understand that, because there are times when, we're going to be faced with decisions around big apartment buildings that are enormous, and require big, either, uh, denitrification systems, or being hooked up to sewer, or all this other stuff. Absolutely. That's part of the housing conversation, right? But there's also stuff that can be done on the margins. And by legalizing housing in those more rural neighborhoods, in those more rural areas, but staying within the same intensity of use, is another way that we can add gently more apartments, more of the type of housing that is naturally affordable to our workforce, without it being, frankly, even noticeable to the neighborhood.
Steph, we just had a question from Tom in the
Sure.
chat just a minute ago. He's asking, is it your sense that local Cape businesses and towns are willing to raise pay rates significantly above the Massachusetts state minimum wage to help people that do wish to work in our communities?
Um, so that's a interesting question.
Yeah.
Um, I think the answer to that is yes, to a point, right? But one, I don't know a lot of small business owners on the Cape that are just like making bank. And, like a lot of them really, they care about their employees. They're trying to do as much as they can to make sure that their employees stay on the Cape and are paying them and whatnot. So if they do end up raising pay, which they should, to, be paying a livable wage, there's a certain point then that gets passed on to the consumer. So that's where it then starts to come back and go back into that negative cycle that I talked about economically, where then if we say no to housing, we who are left would then be in a situation which we are in right now, of having to pay more for goods and services. So the Cape is becoming less affordable to us, even if we already have homes, even if we already own our homes outright. Um, and then we are also start to see more of the burden with our taxes, because those businesses can't necessarily afford to expand the way that they should be able to. So um, there's a lot of like, yes, it's a yes and to that question. The other thing is I tend to hear people, I'm not saying you're doing this, but I do hear people sometimes say, well, businesses just need to pay more. Well, yes, they do need to pay more, but people who are making over $200,000 a year are struggling to rent or buy on the Cape. So, I mean, are we going to pay our coffee baristas $250,000? How much is that cup of coffee going to cost you, right? Like, there's only so much that you can pull that lever, right? And so I think we've asked a lot of our businesses, and our businesses have, in fact, done quite a lot. A lot of them are actually providing employee housing, which is not a model I'm a big fan of either, because then you're tying your employment to your housing. That's just reminds me a little bit too much of like the Industrial Revolution. But what have we done as residents? What levers have we been willing to push? What level of comfortability do we have to saying yes in my backyard? I hope that answers the question. Um, okay. So the last myth is density is bad for the environment. So what we all live here because it is so beautiful. And so we definitely don't want to ruin our environment. Housing to Protect Cape Cod Coalition has been, big supporters of making sure that we build the necessary wastewater infrastructure, supporting town meeting votes on that. But that being said, uh, density is actually not bad for the environment when you are doing it in such a way that is tied to the planning around sewering. So for basically when you are, if you look at any town's plan for sewering, for our wastewater, the more far away houses are, the more expensive it is in order to connect them. So those more rural neighborhoods are actually always like the last on the list, and the ones that are closer together are always on the first of the list in terms of the area of town they're going to sewer first. So it helps actually when it comes to the affordability piece for the municipality. The second piece to that is, again, going back to that idea of you don't always have to do density, right? You don't always have to do the big apartment buildings. Um, the reason we end up being faced with so many big apartment buildings is because we kept saying no to everything else. But if we said yes, if we do say yes to duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, in our more residential, more rural neighborhoods, we're not going beyond the number of people or bedrooms that are already allowed to be here now under single family only zoning. So that makes it nitrogen neutral. And that is a really critical piece of how we're going to solve both our wastewater crisis and our housing crisis.
Steph, we just had another question from Jay. He asked, you mentioned setbacks. Oh, sorry, another one came in. You mentioned setbacks. How does new accessory dwelling law treat other building regulations? For example, kitchen, bath, light, venting, etc.
I believe that it treats them the same as single family homes. You just have to follow the state building code.
And we have another from Carl that just came in. Is there any conversation about utilizing natural materials like prefab, straw panels, hempcrete, and natural paints, plasters to create housing that is not only healthy for people, but also affordable, long-lasting, fire-resistant, and environmentally friendly?
Well, the affordable piece is the challenge with that, right?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, a lot of these newer technologies tend not to be affordable, and that is definitely the big challenge. But at the Home Builders and Remodelers Association, we actually just had not last month, still this month, still January. We actually just had a little showcase at our monthly dinner where we had people who have environmentally friendly and energy code friendly products showcase their products. And so we had this one really cool one that was actually using the like remnants of timber when from sawmills to create the filling. I can't remember what it's called. The pink stuff up in your attic. Um, but to use that
Insulation.
instead. But
Installation.
Insulation.
Installation. Thank you. It's been a long day. So there are some really cool products coming onto the market. The challenge is just making sure that they are, again, affordable. See, the other piece to that question, Jay, and it is an important one, is are we applying it across the board, right? Like, so, a lot of times there are policies that are proposed that say, for apartment buildings, for new things, you need to do X, Y, and Z. And it doesn't get as evenly applied to single family homes or to things that have been around for a long time, right? So we continue to kind of put the burden on people who are already struggling, essentially, instead of kind of spreading it out, and making sure that our commitment and our responsibility to addressing, global warming and our environment is something that we all share in. There is a tendency sometimes in public policy to put that burden on people who are already being left out of the housing market. And that's just one of the areas that we want to try to balance really well. So I've talked about the problem, I've talked about the solution. Now I'm going to talk about how to talk about the solution, how to talk about this, how to engage. Before I do that, are there any other questions that folks have on the kind of the content, the housing piece? You don't see anything, Catherine?
Nope, nothing in the chat, but people are welcome to unmute if they wish.
Okay. I think, Ruth, did you have your hand up? Hold on, we'll see if we can unmute you. You have to hit the unmute button.
Unmute me. Okay.
There you go.
Okay. I asked what zoning changes you would recommend, like about lot size. In some areas, we've heard there's a 2-acre for one family dwelling, which is ridiculous. In at one time, the lot sizes were much, much smaller. And is there a recommended lot size for the different sizes of homes? Single, a duplex, triplex, and so on.
Yeah, I think as we haven't, as a coalition, necessarily agreed upon a specific policy that we're pushing at this point, but I would say that taking a look at minimum lot sizes is definitely something we all agree needs to be done. You know, and I go back to the environment for a moment because one of the really cool projects that Housing Assistance did was to partner with the Association to Preserve Cape Cod to take a look at areas of developable land and say, what's really critical for the environment, for preservation, and what areas are ideal for housing, like along Route 28 and public transportation and hooked up to sewer, all that sort of stuff. And then what's kind of like a toss up, what's in the middle, right? And they did this really cool mapping project. So I'm prefacing my remarks by saying that it's important that as we look at potentially reducing lot sizes, that we also keep in mind that there are also opportunities to set aside land as well for environment, because no one necessarily wants to see every last little bit of land built up, right? It's better to have it as a reuse of our existing properties rather than to sort of build everything, build everywhere. But yeah, I would say reducing minimum lot sizes is definitely something that we can and should take a look at. Again, in line with our wastewater planning and open space preservation planning.
I also wanted to ask about modular housing. What about bringing in the modular, or what we used to call prefabricated?
Yeah. So so Hack is doing that actually with one of their properties right now. I believe they mentioned in Orleans. It's so funny because they mentioned that, Ruth, because I was just having a conversation about that today. And don't quote me on this because this is what someone told me, so I'm not positive this is true, but I believe right now one of the barriers to doing that in Massachusetts is that under state building code, or maybe under fire code, I'm not sure which, probably building code. Prefab is considered, or modular housing is considered in the same vein as mobile homes. So then they're not, so essentially we would need to do advocacy on the state level to change that in order to make it easier to do it here. And again, I think that we can, as municipalities, we can take a look at form-based code to say, okay, great, if we're doing modular housing, sure, but we want to make sure that it looks like ABC again, so that it doesn't look like it belongs in California, but it kind of fits in here, right? So those are different ways that we can address that.
Well, it would be helpful to know what is realistic locally. What advocacy, specific advocacy might be effective locally,
Yeah.
rather than getting deferred to the state. So,
Sure.
do you have specific things we should be
Yeah, I would
advocating?
say
Yeah.
absolutely. I would say the next thing to take a look at is duplexes. Legalizing duplexes in all neighborhoods. Again, sort of staying within the footprint, the setbacks of single family homes. Um, there's no, that's a low hanging fruit. We just did it with ADUs. There's no reason we can't do it with uh with duplexes. Another piece that I would say that we can and should push for is under the Affordable Homes Act that passed last year. It made it easier also for starter homes, um, which are more single family homes, but they're smaller and closer together. So pushing towns to take advantage of that, like say for example, the I think Rob Brennan from Housing Assistance brought that up as it relates to the Marston's Mills School project in Barnstable. That's a great property where the town could get paid for allowing those starter homes. And then the last policy piece that I'll mention, I think, is another low-hanging fruit is tiny homes, which is a little bit different because starter homes are single-family homes that are owned, um, whereas tiny homes could be just little cottage colonies. Um, I live in a basically a pre-existing non-conforming tiny home community. I live in like the main house that was built in the 1800s, and then there are cottages out back that used to be, summer cottages that now are rented year round. And we have our nice little own little community. Making it easier to build those, another really low hanging fruit, especially in areas that are being sewered. So I will move on to the advocacy piece, and thank you for your questions, Ruth. So first, I just like to talk about like, what does the process look like? Um, and generally it starts off with a lot of times you're going to hear about it when the legislative authority is voting on it, which in Massachusetts is either town council in Barnstable, elected town meeting in Falmouth, or open town meeting in all the rest of the Cape towns and islands towns as well. So for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to talk about open town meeting since it applies to most of you on the call. So some of you may have never been to town meeting. It's hyper local where people are voting on budgets. They're voting on sign ordinances. Like sometimes it can be a little dry, a little boring, right? But every now and then there's something spicy that gets proposed, and that's when you hear about it, and that's when people tend to come and show up, and that's when you might see a proposal around duplexes, tiny homes, um, or starter homes come up. But at that point, that's the end, right? That is the last step in the process. So it's important to know that there are a lot of earlier points of engagement that you can get involved in. If all you can do is show up and vote in favor of pro-housing policies, that's totally fine. But if you want to engage at an earlier stage, here are some spots to do it. So first is the proposal, right? It's going to be either coming internally from town staff or the board or committee, or a lot of times from an outside organization, potentially Housing to Protect Cape Cod, there's individual groups within each community sometimes that are proposing for an idea. It'll go to the appropriate committee, and a lot of cases that's planning board. So planning board is going to have a lot of meetings on a zoning change, and that's where the sausage is being made. That's where the devil in the details is. So that's where a lot of times things can go awry. That's where actually our next little training that we'll do in February is going to be talking about the planning board and that process, because it can um, take a simple bylaw and make it very complicated, or vice versa. And so it's always an important point of engagement. And then they have to, whenever there's a zoning change under state law, they have to hold a public hearing. And that's usually on the final thing that's going to end up on town meeting floor. That's another place that it's important to engage in terms of making sure that it gets the requisite votes on the planning board, and then, the Board of Selectmen sees that there's public support for it. It's also where a lot of people tend to turn out against. So having our voices heard is really critical, again, for those select boards, because, I worked for elected officials for many years. You get 5 phone calls or 5 people who show up on any issue. It's like, oh my God, the whole world must feel this way, right? Even though the reality is sometimes those are a vocal minority. So that's why it's really important for us as housing advocates to make sure that we are showing up, and they're not just hearing from people who say, no, no, I don't want to see any change. At some point within this process, possibly even on town meeting floor, there might be some amendments. And usually the amendments are going to be ones that are going to try to restrict it further. So those are different points of engagement where you as a housing advocate can speak up, and make your voice heard. So thankfully, since the pandemic, a lot of decision makers at the planning board level, town council, select board, are having their public meetings on Zoom. The big exception being town meeting. You still have to vote in person at town meeting. You still have to come in town in person. But for all of those meetings that are leading up to town meeting, you can watch from the comfort of your home while you're making dinner. Keep an eye on what's going on, and when it looks like they're going to be taking public comment, you can virtually raise your hand and make your voice heard, or you can hop in your car, run down to town hall and speak up there. I actually saw an advocate do that in Chatham a few years ago. He just always showed up like right as they were starting to take public comment. I'm like, how do you have such good timing? He's like, I'm watching at home. Simple. So one of the things, though, if you do go in person and make your voice heard as a housing advocate, you're going to want to get your hand up right away, or sometimes they have a little clipboard that you have to sign that right away. Because especially if it's particularly, what's the word I'm looking for? A particularly divisive issue, or, there's a lot of contentious issue. That's what I'm looking for. You might have a lot of people want to speak, and if you don't want to be there until, 11 o'clock, you want to try to get in there right away. The other norm here to really understand is that whenever you are speaking during public comment, 99% of the time, maybe 95% of the time, it is only a one-way conversation. You are coming up, you are identifying yourself as a resident or a worker in the town. You're saying, that you're for it. Whatever kind of your pieces, your story, any statistics you want to get in. You can ask questions, but you just can't don't expect that they're going to get into a two-way dialogue with you, because of just the nature of like Robert's Rules of Order, and the way that's just sort of these hearings and meetings are set up. Occasionally there will be more kind of loose and flexible and less formal meetings, and especially if there's not a ton of people there. You might have a chairman we can answer that, no problem. But Otherwise, just expect that this is a kind of a one-way engagement. So, how do we go about public speaking? I know that it can be scary for some folks. One of the most important things is to know your audience, right? So, if you are at a meeting where a lot of people have gone up and said maybe a lot of your talking points, a lot of the things you were going to say, not repeating that, really super critical, because nobody wants to hear the same thing said over and over and over again, right? Um, Particularly if it's a town meeting, people get antsy, they want to get home, all that sort of thing. That doesn't mean don't say anything, but you can say, I just want to say I agree with the things that have been said and maybe add one more thing or your story, something that's unique to you, that's your unique value add. So knowing your audience, really key. Another piece is creating that elevator speech so that it's very clear to the audience, to the decision makers, whether they are planning board members, select board members, or your fellow town meeting voters, um, being able to figure out who are you within the first 30 seconds. Who are you? What do you want? and why? It's like when you were a kid in elementary school and they were having you do those essays, and like, okay, so at the beginning you have an introduction and you say what you're going to say, and then in the body you say it, and then in the conclusion you say what you said. It's kind of like that. And then the third piece about public speaking that we talked about, and our colleague from CDP had mentioned, is the importance of storytelling to differentiate you and your experience from everything else they might be hearing. So I like to use both talking points with statistics in certain points, but also storytelling and having a nice blend. Sometimes decision makers are going to be persuaded, like when I tell um, a select board or a town meeting audience that people making $200,000 a year are struggling to rent or buy, and a lot of them haven't had to engage in the housing market in a long time, I hear a lot of gasps, right? Sometimes that's the appropriate point to go with. Other times, I'm telling them that I'm a 14th generation Cape Codder, and there's no way another 14 generations are going to be able to afford to live here when people making $200,000 a year can't rent or buy, right? So sometimes it's the story, sometimes it's the talking point, and both of those are true. So getting into a little bit more detail on that with the know your audience, um, you know, keeping cool, calm, and collected is also, part of that credibility piece that you want to do as a speaker. Making sure that you're adding some value, not droning on and on. That's as succinct as you can be is always really helpful. The storytelling, I like to tell a story of, I met a gentleman who is a realtor. I can't remember which part of the state, somewhere somewhere not the Cape and Islands, and he has been very successful with his business and also very successful engaging in politics. And his congressman was always good on housing issues, but never like great, never a champion. So one day, he built this relationship, and he went out to dinner with his congressman, and he told him his own personal story about experiencing homelessness as a child. And that story, over a burger, turned that congressman from being okay on, housing and homelessness issues to being an absolute champion. So it connects to people's personal humanity, and can be really critical. The flip side of that is that decision makers aren't making decisions necessarily based on what's good for one person. They have to look at how does it fit into my entire constituency? How does it fit into all, like what's best for all the voters? So that's why those blends of the two, the blending of the two really makes a big difference. So if I say, uh, yes, I personally am struggling with this, or I'm a business owner who's struggling with this. It's not just, hey, don't feel bad, feel bad for me and help me. I'm also saying, here are the stats about the other numbers of people who are struggling. We're losing a net of 800 families per year to displacement. Those are working families making less than $100,000 a year. When I bring in those statistics and facts of how it affects the local economy, how it affects everyone, I'm making it harder for them to say no to. And that's really what you're aiming to do when it comes to particularly select boards. The other piece when you're dealing with any elected official is the sort of what's in it for me. And I say that with a smile because I worked for wonderful elected officials for many years. But they are always thinking about, um, what are the things that are relevant to me? Why did I get involved? Maybe I'm really concerned. Maybe I am really concerned about wastewater, and that's why I decided to run for office. Or maybe I'm concerned about reelection, what have you. When you are delivering your message, if you can tie it back to what their personal priorities may be. So, for example, the case of the wastewater, talking about the importance of having that open space preservation, talking about the importance of nitrogen neutral zoning reforms, things like that, that are going to make sure that we are addressing the environmental crisis as well as the housing crisis. And talking about things like when I was chair of my town's finance committee, we kept having, and we continue to have, town departments talking about how hard it is to find anyone that they can hire. So, one of the things that I said to voters at town meeting was, listen, um, we're going to have to start coming to you asking for you to pay for housing stipends for town employees if we keep saying no to housing. Like this is going to come back and hurt you in your pocket. You don't want making those connections of what's important to those individual decision makers is something that really can be very persuasive. So how do you bring it together? It's always important to, not just identify yourself by your name and what precinct or village you're in, but if you have a connection like I'm a small business owner in town, or I work at such and such place that people are familiar with, it creates that, oh, this isn't some person calling in from you know uh, Paris, Texas, right? This is somebody that I know or I might see on a daily basis. Doing that kind of little one-line preview, I'm here because I support XYZ, or I'm here because I oppose XYZ. Letting them, you don't want to bury the lead of why you're there. And then using those framing, the talking points, the personal stories, if you're feeling bold, if you feel like you've done enough of this that you can address some false information, maybe using some of the myth busting points that was earlier in my slide deck, great, have at it. Don't feel like you have to. Again, I always like to encourage people to start small and with what you're comfortable with. Um, and if all you're comfortable with is saying, hi, I'm Stephanie, I live in Yarmouthport, I'm here, I support this project because housing is critical to our economy. Thank you. Goodbye. If that's all you can do, that's totally okay. I always tell people that if you've never engaged in any kind of advocacy and you do one thing one time a year, that is 100% improvement, right? And then if you can do a little bit more, that's going to be another 100% improvement. So the last piece is just, if you have kind of gotten into more details, again, it's that kind of closing statement, reiterating your point. And then because it is a thankless job, thanking them, right? Thank you for your service. Thank you for taking the time to listen. Again, more bees with honey than with vinegar. And where you're going to be delivering it, that message is the points that we talked about in that circle of the public meeting, public hearing, town meeting. So that's verbally how you can do it. But, sending emails or old-fashioned letters, also totally, acceptable. Or if you see your selectman or planning board member in the supermarket, and you want to pull them aside and you have the relationship to be able to do that and just say, this is how I'm feeling about that. That's another way that you can deliver your message. And that's it in terms of the basic types of things that Housing to Protect Cape Cod will ask you on generally if you ever get an email from us saying, hey, can you show up and speak in favor of housing? And then there are the people that have done that, feel comfortable and want to take it a step further. And for those people, we love those people. And we'd ask them to, hey, can you organize some of your friends or some other voters in town to show up to town meeting, bring a buddy to town meeting. When I was involved in Cape Cod Young Professionals, we did this whole bring a buddy to town meeting thing, and a bunch of us would go out to dinner beforehand and sit together, and it was fun. But you could also hand out leaflets at town meeting, or write letters to the editor. There's lots of different ways to get engaged. So that's kind of the last bit of my training. I'm guessing there's probably going to be some questions, but I also just want to flag for folks the upcoming workshops are going to get more into those planning board meetings, and how they work. We're going to have two people who serve on different towns planning boards that are pro housing, talk about their experiences, what will be helpful to them in terms of seeing advocates show up. And then in March, we'll just do a town meeting 101 that kind of goes over how does town meeting work, because it is something that literally originates in the 1600s when we could all fit into one tiny church and make decisions for the town. So that's the plan coming up. I will, and you can go to Housing to Protect Cape Cod to register. And I'll take any more questions that you have at this point.
Yeah, just to recap, Stephanie, I wanted to make sure you got through the tail end of your training session. We heard from Molly McGregor, who I know you know very well, a fellow CCY peer. I will be following up with you, Molly, just to get you continued involved with Housing to Protect Cape Cod and our advocacy efforts locally. And she was just reminiscing on when ADUs were coming to Chatham. She worked very closely with you, Steph. Tom, he shared superb insights, Stephanie. And as an elected town meeting member, he's shocked by how much, people focus on maximizing the actions necessary to meet housing requirements. And sometimes it can be a bit depressing, to hear all that NIMBY pressure. So thank you for sharing that, Tom. We're working to get, voices in the room that really provide a full circle, view on the issue and experience. And lastly, Jay Lively followed up on his original question about setbacks. How does new accessory dwelling laws treat other building regulations? So his second question was, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, Stephanie, but he asked, so would two abutters be an option? Abutters donate 10 to 20 common edge of their lots to conservation? And is there a year-round cap by town for tax abatements? Which I don't know the answer to. But we can
I
always
don't.
do our research, Jay, and get back
Yeah,
to
I'm
you.
sorry. Those are great questions. I would have to
Yeah,
take a look into the enabling legislation to be able to answer them. I'm sorry.
that's okay, Jay. We'll follow up with you. Any other questions? You're welcome to unmute and share.
Steph, I just wanted, this is Jillian Douglas in Brewster.
Yeah.
Hi, nice to see you.
Nice to
I
see
just
you.
following up on that question, so that all of those questions related to setbacks and merging of lots or separating of lots, those are all going to be town specific. So it's not going to be something that you'd be able to answer unless you knew the specific town and looked at that zoning. So
Thank you. Yeah, Jillian works, I think, for the town of Barnstable these days. Mallory?
Hi, thanks, Stephanie. Awesome presentation. Really appreciate it. I just wanted to mention that we're all in this together, right? And so there's more than one organization working on this, and we really need to avoid working in silos. So let's all try to be in contact with each other and try to raise voices up. We've got grassroots groups in 4 towns, and we're always happy to share our information, what works and what doesn't. We try to rally people to go to board and committee meetings together. Then we have a template if they can't go that they can send in. And we're happy to share all of those templates, all of that information so that we can work together regionally rather than town by town and organization by organization. So thanks.
Awesome. Absolutely. Elizabeth?
before you take Elizabeth, can I ask Mallory, when you say we, is there a specific organization or website or?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm with a community development partnership, but
Of course, I'm sorry. I knew that. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Um, as I mentioned, I'm on the Assembly of Delegates, and the Cape Cod Commission just completed a regional housing study that was unbelievably fabulous. So I suggest you all look at their website. What the hope is that there will be a regional housing coordinator position created at the county level. I will be this very, very hard. I'm the chair of the committee that will be dealing with this. But so hopefully by spring, maybe there, or you know, end of June, there will be a serious clearinghouse for everyone to contribute all their brilliant information, and this one person will be able to send you to, Stephanie's great at this and Hillary's great at that. So that's what we're hoping. Keep your fingers crossed. And I may be emailing you all to tell you to call your delegates and scream. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for your work, Elizabeth. That's terrific. And unless there's any other questions, I'll just follow up on something I think that Tom said in his comments about sort of being surprised at the restrictions that people want to put on housing production. One of the simple things that I always like to kind of push back on that with is saying, would you apply that to single family homes as well? And if they say no, well, why? And just listen, because there aren't many good reasons, right? So if we're there's a lot of people who say we just don't need any more housing at all, right? So are you proposing putting in a restriction of no more building any more single family homes? Or people who can't put an addition on their home? No? Why not? Because all of your voters would say no, right? So, but logically, it's you got to apply apples to apples and be a little bit, uniform and not be sort of singling out apartments as being some kind of other. And I think that is a good way to combat that type of thinking, and make people really think about it. Because I think a lot of times it's reflexive. People don't like change. Change is scary. I don't like change, right? Nobody does. But I always tell people that change is inevitable. We are seeing the Cape change for the worse, I think, in terms of, um, you know, I talked to somebody today. I was at the Lowe's in Wareham doing something for the home builders, and I talked to a guy who's a cranberry grower, and he knew my grandfather who was a cranberry grower. How many more times am I going to be able to have conversations like that? Right? Like those people are going away really fast. So being able to continue to have roots and having families be here, it's a lot harder to have families on the Cape these days. And so wouldn't it be better for us to be able to be masters of our own destiny and to say, okay, change is inevitable, but we're going to change things for the better, right? And we're going to say, yes to this type of housing, but we're going to say it needs to look like this and it needs to fit in with our wastewater and what have you. And then we're facing the future head on instead of sticking our heads in the sand. So with that, I'll wrap up and thank you all for being such an attentive audience. Appreciate it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you all for your time. As I shared, we'll be following up with an email just to keep everyone engaged, sharing lots of opportunities of future engagement. Don't forget to visit Housing to Protect Cape Cod to register for future trainings and opportunities. And yes, thank you, Stephanie, and thank you to those who are here and listening at a later date, potentially. We look forward to staying in touch.